Online for Authors, I'm chatting with Robert W. Norris, author of The Good Lord Willing and The Creek Don't Rise. Welcome, Robert.
Thanks for having me, Terry. How are you?
I'm just fine, and I'm super excited to have you here. I really enjoyed the memoir. But before we dive in, why don't you give our listeners just a quick peek into what they're going to find when they open up the cover?
Okay, well, the story more or less traces the life and times and, all the problems faced in this life, but of a very high-strung and strong-willed, independent woman and her sensitive and stubborn son. And it really covers basically almost 100 years from beginning to end, because I start the book with my mother's stories about her family and where she came from. She was born in North Dakota and in 1926, and her family was not unlike the Jodes in The Grapes of Wrath, that great book by John Steinbeck. And instead of migrating to the West Coast from Oklahoma, they went from North Dakota, and it took probably a few months before they made it to the West Coast, working a lot of piecemeal jobs along the way, picking fruit and never knowing really when the next meal was going to come or where it was going to come from. And they had a couple of jalopies with all their life's belongings on them and maybe 8, 9, 10 people on board. But they finally arrived in the state of Washington, actually on the Washington side of the Columbia River in a small logging town called White Salmon. And that's where she grew up in the 1930s during the Depression. And she was kind of a tomboy and played a lot of sports, very athletic. And then, of course, World War II came, and she graduated from high school, and not long after that, she met my father, who was a few years older. He had been a hero in World War II and had flown with the invasion of Normandy from England and I think over maybe 75 combat missions, something like that. Yeah. Anyway, after the war, his family moved down to the redwood country of Northern California, and they started a sawmill and a logging business there. And that's where I grew up. I was born in 1951. And so I had a kind of Leave It to Beaver type of childhood out in the country. And I have great memories of playing in the redwoods and fishing and those kinds of things. But my parents eventually divorced, and that's when a lot of problems started. My mother really had a tough time. She faced kind of ostracism from a small logging community that she had to deal with, and then was
because divorce at that time was far more rare than it is in today's world.
That's right.
And women were kind of held to a higher standard as far as divorce goes. Men seem to be able to divorce and remarry, and women often were seen differently if they chose to do the same.
Yeah, and their economic opportunities, job opportunities were few and far between and not well paying. And anyway, she worked a lot of part-time jobs at a florist and this and that, just trying to feed us kids. There were 3 of us, but she got remarried not long afterwards, more for security for her kids than anything else, I think. Right. But she was a Catholic, and she got excommunicated from the church for remarrying. That was another no-no back in those days.
Right.
But she was a fighter, and she had that Irish humor and temper as well. She wasn't afraid to fight against the church, the authorities, whoever got in her way. And of course, that was the 1960s, and a very tumultuous time. And that's when I became a teenager, and we were watching the war on the news every night, and everybody knew somebody who had been drafted and had to go to Vietnam. And by the time I turned 18, we were all thinking seriously, what are we going to do? And so as a naive country bumpkin, who really didn't know much about the outside world, I decided to join the Air Force thinking that I would never have to carry a weapon and I wouldn't have to be shipped off to the war. And that's what the recruiter promised. He said, "Oh boy, you're going to be able to play basketball all day long. You'll have adventures. You can see the world." And I said, "Where do I sign?" And that turned out to be a big mistake.
When I read that in the book, my husband is a 25-year veteran, and I know of these tactics. You know, I've heard other people who've been told one thing and then they find out it's something completely different. And when I'm reading that, I'm screaming at you, "Don't sign! Don't sign!"
Yeah, probably my parents were too, but I was stubborn. I wasn't going to listen. I wanted to go off and see the world.
Absolutely.
But anyway, as fate would have it, fate played a cruel trick on me. You know, the job I got put into was the only one in the Air Force that was combat trained, and my job was guarding B-52 bombers that were going off to bomb North Vietnam and later Laos and Cambodia, and with all the napalm and the Agent Orange and everything else. And so, I kind of got influenced by a lot. There was kind of a strong GI movement against the war, growing and getting stronger all the time. A lot of these veterans who were coming back from Vietnam had stories to tell about the My Lai massacre and many other things. And there are a lot of
and the lack of understanding of what the goals were and everything.
Right.
At what point did you join? What year was it that you joined the Air Force?
That was 1969.
Yeah.
And at the beginning of 1970, I was shipped out to a different base where they had all these B-52 bombers. And of course, I got involved with a couple of GIs who had been putting out a kind of underground GI newspaper, anti-war newspaper at the time. And so we started having a little like a conspiracy meeting every night in their rooms, talking about the war and how we could resist and this and that, listening to all the music of the times, Bob Dylan and Crosby, Stills and Nash and many others. But the final straw for me really came when Kent State happened.
Right.
And my order to go to war came shortly after Kent State. And I knew that if I was ever called upon to aim my M16 against other young Americans my age on a college campus, that I couldn't do it. I'd throw my gun down and join the other side. And so at that time, when my order came, there were really only three choices, especially if you were within the military. One was you could run away to Canada and probably never be able to come back to the States. Another was simply just to follow the order and hope you were lucky and go to Vietnam. But I didn't want to do that. And then the third option was to just refuse, and you'd be court-martialed and potentially end up in the brig for 5 years and maybe a dishonorable discharge. But at that time, I found a really good military lawyer who was kind of an anti-war man himself. And rather than run away to Canada and waste his 8 years of law school, he decided he could do more positive work from within the military. And I was his first big case. And so he worked really hard. And at that time, the Supreme Court had made a precedent-setting ruling that not only the historic peace churches like the Mennonites and the Quakers could qualify for conscientious objector status, but also if you had moral and philosophical grounds and were sincere about your beliefs, then it was possible that you could be granted that status. And that's what I applied for. Of course, it was refused and I was court-martialed, and I was sentenced not to the original charge against me, which they called willful disobedience to a direct lawful order, but guilty of a lesser military crime of what they called negligent disobedience to a direct lawful order. And the difference was basically that I never used the word no when I was given the order and I refused. I kept repeating the same sentence, I don't believe I'm physically or mentally capable of killing another human being.
Right. And I found that to be really, that's the part of the law I think that's very interesting when I see different court things, is how something as simple as you were essentially saying no, but with different words. And what you were saying was, I don't think I'm capable. I don't think I'm capable. And because you didn't say no, you got 6 months instead of 5 years.
Right.
Wasn't it
Just
6 months?
right. That
Yeah.
one sentence saved
Right.
4.5 years of my life. That was like the introduction to the power of language.
Yeah.
But anyway, I served my time, and I got out of the service and returned to society and dove headfirst into the counterculture and everything that involves. And I was reading a lot of Jack Kerouac at the time and working labor jobs. And eventually I didn't really feel a part of America anymore. And I wanted to see what the rest of the world was about. And I came across, well, of course, On the Road by Jack Kerouac had a great influence. And so did books by Hermann Hesse, like Siddhartha and Journey to the East and these types of books. And I found a book called Europe on $5 a Day, and how to get by just backpacking and hitchhiking and have a great adventure. And so I left the States.
I'm in.
Yeah. Just like when the recruiters put the paper in front of me, where do I sign?
There comes another one. Here he goes.
Itchy feet. Maybe I inherited that from my mom, but
I think you might have. Yeah.
At any rate, I bummed around Europe for a few months and was again heavily influenced by all these young hippie backpackers from different European countries, and they all seemed to have really fulfilling and active lives, meaningful lives, where they were playing music, writing poetry, painting. And of course, everywhere you went, there was art and art history and the influence there. So when I came back to the States again, I wanted to express myself in the same way. And so I started writing then. And for the next few years, I returned to Europe once about 4 years later and did an around the world trip, went through the old hippie trail and into places that are very difficult to go now, Afghanistan, Iran, and India. And again, heavily influenced by the people I met and the experiences I had. And at that time, my dream was to live and work and study in a foreign country. And I had a chance when I was 32 years old. A writer friend introduced me to a friend who was living in Japan, and their economy was really starting to boom at the time. And there were a lot of jobs for just foreigners passing through who wanted to teach English as a second or foreign language. And so I stayed. I followed his advice, and again cast my fate to the winds, and arrived in Japan at the age of 32. And in the book, all of that leading up to that moment is in the first book. And then the second book is about my life.
From that point forward.
From that point, and, adjusting to the culture, learning the language, finding my wife, getting a really good job, and then getting involved in peace education and activities. And in the meantime, my mother, in her 40s, she had always wanted to fly, and she started taking flying lessons, and she got a qualification as a pilot for small aircraft like a Cessna. And she actually worked for 2 summers as a fire spotter for the Forestry Service.
And I loved that. When I read that, I thought, oh my gosh, how amazing is that? Right? I mean, this is a woman born in the 1920s.
Yeah.
And she's off flying Cessnas for the Forest Service. I just thought that was fabulous. Yeah.
Yeah, she was way ahead of her time, and she didn't take any guff. She was the only woman in her classes.
I'm sure she was.
and she got into a few spats, with them, and always won, and always, let them know that she had won in a very, Irish humorous way.
Right.
But,
right.
And then she ended up divorcing again. The second marriage didn't work out, but being a pragmatist and a strong, stubborn, strong-willed person herself, she began taking night classes to become qualified as a legal secretary. And she started a career as a legal secretary in her 50s and continued to work until she was 78. And then all the years that I was in Japan, she came over maybe 7-8 times, and I started teaching her Japanese on the internet, and so she would come and play around, go have her little adventures in the streets, trying out the Japanese expressions that she knew. And just to see that face smiling, it was really a wonderful experience. And she lived till she was 95 and had a really interesting, fulfilling, loving life. She taught me more about perseverance and inner strength and unconditional love than anyone that I ever met. So when she died, I wanted to
go ahead.
I was just going to say that when she died, I wanted to somehow preserve her spirit. And the book was for her.
I think you did a really good job with that, because in addition to learning a lot about you, I came to love your mother. And I kept thinking, what a shame that I can't meet her, because I think I would have really enjoyed a conversation with her just to kind of see where it went and see. I think what I loved about her was that she had a lot of spunk, and that she was a lifelong learner. Like she just kept saying, well, there's nothing that I can't learn if I choose to. And she would just go out and do it, because I'm sure that at 50 people were saying, well, you can't start a new career now. And she's like, well, watch me. I'm going to go get it. I'm going to go get my degree so that I can do this. And watch me. I'm going to fly planes. And watch me. I'm going to learn Japanese. And, she just, she even was painting toward the end, where she was, and doing art and doing other things. She just was constantly trying new things and seeing how she could stretch herself. And I loved that about her.
Oh, geez, Terry, that makes me feel great. You are like the ideal reader for this book. If you can love my mother that much, she's probably looking down with St. Patrick, smiling right now.
Smiling. Yeah. Well, there was just, I don't know. I think I really enjoy it when I see a woman who didn't let someone else tell her what was and what was not to be. Like your mom wasn't necessarily like in the face of society. But she was. Do you know what I'm saying? She was like quietly in the face of society. Will you say I can't do this? One of my favorite stories, and I was laughing to myself, is when the priest would not give her communion. And instead of going up to him later, or, stomping out furiously, she goes right to where he is in the back room where she's not supposed to be, and lets him know, what are you doing and why didn't you give me communion? And I just thought, oh my gosh, can you imagine having the guts to just go storming up there? Yeah, I loved it. I was laughing, and I could only imagine what the other congregants were.
The whole congregation, because actually the way she told it, and of course she was a great storyteller, and she would occasionally embellish the story a bit.
Of course, that's the best part of storytelling.
But apparently, when she went to take communion, and there were, several people kneeling at the communion counter there, not counter.
The rail, or the altar-ish.
Right. Yeah. And he would take the wafer and stick it in each one of their mouths with their tongue sticking out. And he just bypassed her and went to the next person. Didn't say anything. Of course, maybe 100 people in the congregation are watching. And she reached out and grabbed his arm and stared at him and said, I want to take communion. And he pulled his arm away from her and just continued. And then that's when she stormed into his room in the back.
Just blows my mind. I can only imagine that would have been one that everybody went home and was going.
Oh yeah, the gossip.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm curious. You have a subtitle for your memoir, and it's called Pentimento: Memories of Mom and Me. First of all, Pentimento is a word I had not heard before. So why don't you explain what that is and how it came to be part of your title?
Well, pentimento is a word used in the art world, and it describes when a painter is starting a kind of rough draft and doing a sketch of a scene that he or she has in their head. And maybe it starts out as like a mountain scene in the distance, and they're not happy with it. And so they paint over it. They have a fresh idea, and in a sense, they repent. And so they paint over the original image. And I read a memoir by the author, or actually the playwright from the 1930s, Lillian Hellman, who was quite famous in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. She was the lover. They never got married, but she was the lover of Dashiell Hammett, who was one of the hard-boiled detectives, film noir type, hard-boiled guy, and he had a big influence on her. But in the 1930s, there were a lot of artists and actors and studio producers and directors and whatnot that were kind of meeting up to investigate some alternatives to capitalism, because at that time, during the Depression, capitalism seemed to be doomed, and communism was still pretty fresh on the scene. And so people were just discussing having these intellectual kind of study groups, and they didn't necessarily become communists or members of the Communist Party, but they met regularly with known communists. And so in the 1950s, after the war, during the witch hunting days of the House Un-American Activities Committee, led by Senator Joseph McCarthy, all these leftists and intellectuals and artists were called before the committee to sort of rat on their communist friends, and he refused to cooperate and was sent to prison. But Lillian Hellman was also called in, and she didn't really cooperate, but she didn't refuse to answer. And she worded kind of like what happened to me in my court martial. She kind of slithered out of any trouble by, really clever wording. And she became quite famous for that. And then later in the 1960s, she wrote a series of memoirs, and the title of one memoir was Pentimento. And she used that title as a metaphor for memory. And, when you're a younger person, your memories of whatever experiences, whatever's happening around you are very fresh. But as you get older, they change, and you interpret them slightly differently, just like the painter paints over the original sketch. And I thought, that's great.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what happened to me after my mom died, and I had decades worth of correspondence and tapes and pictures and everything, and a lot of material to go through when I was first thinking about, writing the first draft. And as I went through all that stuff and read through a lot of our old letters and emails, and my memories of her and my own life changed in the same way. And so, I thought, Pentimento Memories, that would be an apt title, or
Absolutely. Subtitle. Yeah. I love that. That was very interesting. And it was one of those words that was like, okay, let me really dig into this and find out what this is and why it's in the title. So that was, I enjoyed that. When you were doing your traveling, you've done lots of traveling, and you've seen far more places than I've ever been. Was there any one place that stuck out to you before you get to Japan? Because I know obviously Japan means a lot to you. You stayed, but prior to getting there, is there any place that really stuck out to you as a place that, if you had to say everyone should visit here, this is something to see. Was there any place like that for you?
Originally, on my first journey, when I hitched across the States, I was 22, I think, at the time. So still very young and impressionable. And that was my first time outside of the United States. And so when I was bumming around Europe, I found Spain to be a fascinating country, even though at that time Franco was in power and, it was still an autocratic society. But the people were just wonderful and kind, and the scenery was so beautiful, and actually Greece was also another place that was very beautiful, and the slow pace. I remember really almost pristine blue and white, the colors. I would highly recommend those places even today. But as far as places that really affected me emotionally, Afghanistan, just because of the extreme difference in life. It was like, at the time, I felt as if I was traveling back into the Old Testament, and life hadn't really changed. I mean, the women were wearing this,
the hijab? Is that what?
No, not the hijab. It's in Iran, they call it the, let's see, I forget the words on
That's
my
all right.
tip of my
That's
tongue.
all right.
But you couldn't see their face. There was just like a wire, a mesh, and you couldn't make out any features of the face, and just barely you could see their hands, no skin at all. You couldn't see their feet, and they were like almost like ghostly characters. Very patriotic society, but the people were very, very kind, and I was treated extremely well. You know, I mean, the images you get of Iran and Afghanistan, Pakistan, these countries in the media is, you know, they're always portrayed as, you know, really terrible terrorists and, you know, bloodthirsty killers.
And it's not to say that there isn't some of that, but that isn't. It's the same thing. My husband and I rode across the United States on a bicycle. During the summer of 2020. And during that time, I mean, that was COVID, political unrest. There was a lot of stuff. And people talked about, you know, oh, how horrible the whole country is going to hell in a handbasket. And when we rode across, we didn't find that. I'm not saying it didn't exist. I'm just saying that generally speaking, that's not what you find. I think that's true of where, you know, whatever you have in your mind about another place, another country, another people, is probably really tainted by what you see in news and other things. And that when you get there, you see something very different.
Yeah. Well, that's the one lesson I've learned in all my travels in both the States, because I bummed around the States for several years working here and there. I must have seen 35 or 40 states and then all the different countries I've been to, that if you are open to other people, people will be open to you.
I agree.
Yeah.
I absolutely agree. And you found that true when you came to Japan, because it would have been very easy to remain an outsider.
Right.
But that's not what you chose to do. You chose to be very open to the culture and very open to the language and very open to the people. And you found that they were very open to you as well. Right.
And I think that was probably a result of having traveled through many other countries too, you know, not for any length of time. I think the longest I stayed in any other country was maybe 2 months. But I would pick up enough language to, or at least nouns and verbs, you know, of how to order food in a restaurant or buy something at a market and haggle over the price a bit. You know, numbers are important.
Right.
Basic communication. But I found that whenever I would just make the attempt, that people would loosen up and just overwhelm me with kindness. And so I wasn't afraid of the unknown. You know, I found that the unknown was wonderful.
Right. In fact, I thought it was really interesting. You had only been in Japan a rather short time, and the next thing you know, you're on a softball league.
Right.
You know, you can speak almost no Japanese. You have, you know, a very, very, very limited amount, and yet they're like, "Hey, great, come with us. We need you." And that doesn't happen to someone who's closed off. And so you must have shown that you were very open to being part of where you were living. And then that was, you arrived in Japan in what year?
That was 1983.
Yeah.
So I've been here
quite some time.
42 years now.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Where'd all the time go?
I know. When I think about time, I do the same thing. It's like, oh, wow, that's, all right then. So I know you've written several other books. Do you have anything coming down the pike? Are you still writing, or what are you doing next with your life?
I'm glad you asked me that, because I thought this was my last book, to tell the truth. I mean, I'm 74 years old, and I thought maybe I've emptied the tank, you know. But and that book was actually 2 books in one. You know,
right.
I probably should have cut it into 2 books and tried to, you know, hawk it as 2 books to the publishers. But when you're in your 70s, I started writing that when I was 70. So, you know, your sense of mortality becomes very strong. And I didn't want to wait 4 or 5 years just to be rejected. Or if they did take book 1, then it might be another 4 or 5 years.
5 years to get 2 came out. You wanted to see it happen, right?
Right. I slammed them both together in one, you know, long volume. But so far, I've had really good responses. You know, if people are willing to read that much, it's almost 500 pages. So it's a challenge. But most of the readers that have contacted me through email or different reading groups and whatnot have said that they fell in love with my mom in the first few pages, and they stuck with it to the end, you know, just to see what would happen. And so that's really gratifying to hear that. But anyway, I came up with another idea in January of things that I had kind of glossed over in the last book about my life in Japan, because my God, if I had included the details about everything, it would have been more than 1,000 pages. And
I'm glad you didn't do that.
Yeah.
500 was about my limit. Not that it wasn't good, but you get to the point, it's like, I need to move on to my next book.
That's right. But there were so many influential people here, and I was able to kind of use my experiences and get involved in peace education activities in both the classroom and then in the publishing world, and then giving talks. I ended up speaking to large groups in Japanese. And of course, the Japanese, because of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, are very receptive to any kind of anti-war. I mean, it's part of their constitution.
Right.
And so I became deeply involved with a lot of people, and had a lot of, I think, practical ideas that worked really well in the classroom for me. And so I have just finished yesterday the first draft of a new book that I'm playing with the title of All That We Are, subtitle of Reflections on My Years from 1992 to 2016 of peace education activities and friendships in Japan.
Oh, and that sounds good. Yeah.
Yeah. And it came out to about 50,000 words. And then I've got 6 appendices that come out to about 25,000 words. There's a couple of academic articles, one on the history of conscientious objectors in World War II, and the other is on a comparison of GI resistance to the Iraq War and Vietnam War. You know, the Iraq War was basically an all-volunteer army, and then the Vietnam War was
mostly conscripted, yeah.
Right, and so a lot of similarities, but a lot of differences too. And just to put a little stamp on that period of history, you know, that like a footnote maybe. But,
right. Oh, I love that. I love that.
And so I'm going to send it out, and I've got a couple of editor friends who are looking at it right now, and no worry about it turning into 500 pages. I think it maybe be around 200 with the appendices.
Wonderful. So, hey guys, if you want to keep this conversation going, head on over to Novels and Latte Book Club on Facebook. There you're going to have a chance to win a digital copy of Robert's book. Then all of a sudden I can't say the name without okay, The Good Lord Willing and the Creek Don't Rise. And by the way, I love that your mom had that ability to use these country bumpkin type sayings, and I
the
love
Good Lord
that.
Willing and the Creek Don't Rise.
Right?
She was a very optimistic person. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, can I show a cover? My mother's picture is on the cover.
Absolutely.
Give people this is.
Bring it over this way. There we go. There she is.
Yeah, that's my mother in high school. Yeah.
Absolutely beautiful. So, Robert, if someone wanted to get in touch with you, talk with you about this book, talk with you about other things that you're writing, talk with you about Japan or visiting or moving there or whatever, how can they get up with you?
Just check my website. It's real easy. It's all lowercase letters, but one word, Robert W Norris, Robert, Robert W, Norris, NORRIS.com. And
I'll have
everything's
that in the
there.
Show notes.
Yeah, everything will be there, and links to places. If you're sort of anti monolithic Amazon corporate bookseller, you can go to bookshop.org or get an ebook version. It's all there. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, Robert, go ahead.
I was just going to say my email address is there too.
Fantastic. And like I said, guys, I'll have all that in the show notes to make it easy for you to find. Robert, thank you so much for being with me today. I've truly enjoyed the book. Everybody run right out and grab it. Thank you for being with me today.
This was fun. Thank you, Terry.
Thank you for listening to Online for Authors, where I, Terry M. Brown, author of character-driven fiction and host of the podcast, introduce readers to characters they'd love to invite to lunch. Tune in next Tuesday for another podcast episode.